All right. So we are now moving into the very last part, and I'm going to combine chapter 11 and 12 together because they kind of do play off each other. And I might not go exactly in the order the book does because, I kind of have my own order like I like to do things when it's talking about evolution. And it's kind of a fun topic because a lot of students really want to talk about it because they really haven't got to talk about it before in class. So we're going to go through some of these slides, and then I'm going to have another one talk about the support for evolution, and then a short one about classification here at the end. So I just want to remind you about our good old Mother Earth. Earth is like the Goldilocks planet. When we talked about at the very beginning about life, it had to happen in the perfect conditions for everything to happen. If you think about it, we're the right distance from the sun. We have this geothermal energy from our core that keeps us warm. We have the atmosphere that absorbs heat throughout the day but keeps it in. Water is so important because it absorbs a lot of that heat, then releases it at night so we don't freeze to death. And it's kind of interesting. It always seems like we've been increasing in temperature more and more. Climate change, you could be for or against it, but it is kind of interesting because to see how things have changed over the time. I'm recording this and it is 108 outside, so it seems like summers get warmer and warmer. But that's what we are, we're resilient people, and Earth, she's pretty resilient and adaptive too. And what was really interesting with this pandemic, it seemed like it gave her a chance to breathe. You especially saw nature coming out a little bit more, but it's kind of interesting. It's really cool. So I've kind of hit on this before about the history of life. Earth's been around for about 4.8 billion years. And when it comes to how long life has been around, the very first life was these prokaryotes, or very simple cells. And I'll talk about the tree of life in a little bit. But it has been shown that, the very first life on Earth was thought to be a very simple cell. It just had those basic units you needed to survive. And then eventually, as Earth started to change, we started to see the atmosphere change. We had oxygen start to show up. And we started to see a shift from doing only photosynthesis to cellular respiration. And then eventually, that single cell apartment prokaryote got a little more complex and got to the eukaryotes. And then those were single celled for a while, and then we started to get multi-celled organisms. And then eventually we start to see more and more diversity happen. We eventually get to where we move to land. We start to get plants, mammals, the short little history of our dinosaurs, to where, we just have humans. If you think about how long Earth's been around, we've only been here a short amount of time. Go watch Cosmos. I really love that show. It really makes you appreciate just astronomy, physics, biology in general. I'm excited that the new season's coming out. Now, how did life start on Earth? That's a question we've been trying to answer. The Miller-Urey experiment that I mentioned before, and here's another link to the video, kind of talks about that. Was it the right combination of things coming together to make it happen? We just don't know. That's one of the questions. Was it life that fell from an asteroid that hit Earth, and that was that first single-celled organism? We just don't know. It's kind of fascinating, and it's one of those questions we can't get. That's why it's called a theory of evolution, because we just don't know. We don't have enough to back it up and make it a law. So this is a huge debate. It comes to that creator versus evolution aspect of it. Turn my watch off. Now, it's been a debate in society over years because we just don't know. People are like, where's your scientific proof? And I'll talk about that in a little later on. But this has been a debate that goes on. And I'm not going to tell you if you're right or wrong, whatever view you have on it. And honestly, when I kind of think about it, I don't think it's either this or that. It may be, what if it's a combination of both? Pretty much when we talk about evolution, it's descent with modification, how things change over time. And there's different types of theories when it comes to it. But I invite you to watch this video. It's a TED Talk, and it talks about how maybe it's this, not this or that, but a combination of this. Is really cool. I came across it because I don't know exactly where I stand. I am a scientist and I see all the scientist support, but then I'm like, why can't we create life in the lab then. So it really makes you wonder. So watch this, it's really cool. So just a basic review of genetics. We can have multiple alleles, or versions of our genes. Now, a population, so all these little, it looks like we have puppies going on here, they all have different alleles that might lead to their different phenotypes that they have. Now, all of their alleles together is what we call the gene pool. Now, the gene pool is what's going to drive what the population is, and changes to the gene pool will have an overall effect on how the population changes and will drive evolution. So early on, we tried to explain how do we know what's happening and why. So early on, belief was a belief on special creation. Everything just magically appeared on Earth. Like everything was planned. Whoever was going to do this, hand out every single species and set it all on. Boom, they all showed up on the same day. That's it. Nothing's going to change. And this was happening when the Earth was young. But then, how do we know all species showed up? How do we know they're not changing? That's one of those things that's really confusing. If you hear dings, it's because I'm getting text messages through my computer. I'm sorry. But then, if this happened, how do you explain fossils? You know, they used to say these are faulty attempts at just arose in rock. So we hit our mistakes that didn't work. Makes you wonder, how did we explain this? Now, early on, Georgie Louis Buffon, he was one of the first to suggest that closely related species arose from common ancestors and they're changing. So not everything just didn't show up at once, like things were slowly changing over time. That might explain why we're seeing some of these fossils. And at the same time, we're starting to get more of an understanding of geology, of rocks, and why things are what they are. Now, one of the very early evolutionary thoughts was done by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So he was a French naturalist, and he kind of used this theory that was the use it or lose it. So with him, it was proposed that he had these two observations. So you're going to inherit traits from your ancestors. So whatever traits your parents gain throughout time, think of them as collecting little Pokemon. They give them to you, and you automatically get them. All right. So whatever they do, the more traits they get, the more traits you get. If your parents didn't do anything, you get nothing. Sorry about that. But he also had this use it or lose it. So yeah, you might have got it, but if you don't use the characteristics, then you're going to lose it. So, you know, he thought like the Lamarck's giraffe is one of the key things that they started talking about, that, you know, he had this neck, but he started using it a little bit more, stretching it. And him causing to stretch his neck is what caused it to physically get longer, and he gets more and more leaves. This theory is later disproved, but this is one of the early thoughts. And, you know, think about how you would have thought about to explain change over time, if, you know, without your basic understanding of biology now. Now, Darwin's voyage is one of the key things. Charles Darwin is our father of evolution, pretty much is what we consider him. He wrote the book, The Origin of Species, and he used it to talk about his voyage on the Beagle. So this is a little path of all the different places they visit, and he was the naturalist of the ship. And what he did was he observed everything. He's one of those people that likes to watch. I love to people watch, you know, but he loved to watch and see all the differences in the different organisms between the different areas, especially between those on islands and those on the mainland. Because you think of an island, it's an isolated population. If it's a population that's just specific to there, then you wouldn't expect to see a similar species on the mainland. So he wrote The Origin of Species, and it kind of produced some controversial topics. And what he wrote is how many species can change gradually over many, many generations and become better adapted to new environmental conditions. Totally going against saying, hey, you know, everything showed up like it is, how it is, and nothing changes. And this was come to known as natural selection. Now, one thing that is associated with Darwin are his finches. So he did spend a lot of time looking at the Galapagos, and one thing that he noticed that was all, especially with finches, that they occur in various places, that like the beaks were a lot of variety in it. And what was noticed is the beaks would change too. Depending on what the environment is, the beak would have to change to adapt. So if it was an environment that was possibly going through a drought, you would see the beaks change in the finch population over time because maybe the seeds got more hardy, so they needed a stronger, bigger beak to break seeds. Or once the drought was over, you don't need the big beak, and maybe you needed a smaller beak in order to reach different flowers. This is one of those things. Darwin's finches has been something people love to talk about. Now, at the time that he was proposing this whole idea of natural selection, people were very against it because, you know, it was things showed up, boom, that's how it worked. Another scientist, Alfred Wallace, he had a lot of similar ideas. He is also an observer, a naturalist, and he observed a lot from his observations in South America and Southeast Asia. And he came up with his own very similar idea to natural selection. Now, these two were kind of, like I said, these opinions were kind of rejected at first. And it wasn't until we started to link things together. So if you remember me telling you about Mendel's work on peas, his work wasn't really appreciated until later on when we started to understand more about DNA and genes and how they're passed on. And it wasn't until we started putting the puzzle pieces together that we got more of a wider picture of what evolution is and how it's driven and how genes drive evolution. So what is it? I'm going to put thinning the herd right here. I think this is what we're doing naturally. However your view on mask and all the other stuff is, but you know, this whole virus has really brought about a huge awakening about our population in general and how we view science. And for me as a scientist, it's been very sad because a lot of basic science is getting ignored. And I don't know, this is like, if we want to talk about it one day, an online session, we can, but as for a scientist, it's very sad for a lot of us right now because we spend years and years becoming experts in field, and all of a sudden it seems people get Google Science degrees and they become experts and their opinion is the one that matters, and they're going to do that regardless of what it might affect the whole population. But when it talks about evolution, sorry for that side rant, we're talking about the change characteristics in a population over generations. So it's going to take time. Evolution isn't a boom, overnight kind of thing. So it's going to take over time. If you go back to the very first, one of the first lectures, I actually put a link to the Darwin Awards. It's actually, Darwinism is also, you know, applied when we talk about the theory of evolution, you know, survival of the fittest. There are other things that change. Short-term environmental changes might really change how fast we have to adapt. And there's also things with evolutionary, you know, just our population and our lifestyle. Think about humans in general. Our lifestyles have really changed, especially with the you know, evolution of fast food, how easy it is available, and pretty much that is a core of a lot of people's diets, making things easier. Now that a lot of us have to do our jobs where we're sitting behind desk, I'm working online pretty much since March. You know, so I'm having to find ways to make sure I'm still keeping active where I lost those times where I was walking around the classroom or in the lab. And sometimes it's just lifestyle changes have influence. It's like the average size of a woman's dress size has increased over the years. It's just by choices. Nothing physically happens genetically to us. It's just what we do to ourselves. Now, when it comes to natural selection, this is how populations adapt to their changing environment. So an example right here, it's like this little grasshopper right here has found this camouflage in order to blend in a lot better so the frog won't eat them as a tasty snack. Basically, as I had this one comment I said right here, when you're just like a little animal out in the wild, you have no idea. You have these two things. Like you come across something, you're going to ask it, like, can I eat it? All right, you know, because I'm hungry, you got to eat to survive. Is it going to eat me, or am I going to have to run away, or can I mate with it? Because I got to pass my genes on to the next generation. If you can figure out all three of these things, you're going to survive. and then you can pass your genes on to the next generation, and then so on and so on. So getting the right combination of that is going to result in evolutionary change. So if you suck at one of these three things, then you're probably not going to find a mate. You probably won't survive. You might die off because you can't find anything to eat. You're too slow. Something's going to eat you. You're kind of scraggly looking. No one's going to mate with you because they want the strong genes to pass on to their offspring. One key thing is evolution never stops. It's always changing. There's no real goal. We don't know what the final endpoint is. Now, natural selection is as things change to best adapt to their environment. I have Watch Me. This is a cool little video. It's a little cartoon with little rock critters and a big dinosaur bird that comes to eat them. And you'll see how what might have been an advantage at one point in time winds up being a disadvantage because the environment changed. So you have to adapt because their environment's constantly changing and it doesn't care about you. It'll be like, whatever, then change and get over it and wake up and get with the system. So how do we get to evolution by following natural selection? Well, we have to get some genetic variation to the genotype via mutation. And when we change the genetic makeup, that's going to lead to a new phenotype. So new alleles are going to appear, and that leads to a new physical condition. And then if it's something that's positive, we're going to act upon it by natural selection. So if it gives you an advantage, why not share that advantage with other people, you know? And then how species will thrive, and those that don't have the advantage get selected for against. And you're going to get more and more offspring, and then that's going to influence the gene pool because now you're introducing this new allele into the gene pool, and it gives you an advantage. So you're going to see that selected more and more, and the gene pool is going to change. There's also others that could cause speciation. We'll hit on it eventually. Geographic or reproductive isolating. These happen, and they can really change how it happens to certain species and if they survive or not. Now, there are several factors that can affect natural selection. Overproduction is one of them. So some species produce far more offspring than can or will survive. It's because they know a lot of them are probably not going to make it to adulthood to where they can actually do that. Overproducers fall into this category. I always think of little turtles because it always breaks my heart to watch the videos of when the little turtles hatch and then they try to make it to the ocean. Like the first battle is making it to the ocean when birds don't eat you, but the second battle is not getting eaten by a shark or a fish as soon as you get there. So they have a lot of offspring, tend to overproduce. They have a fast, mature reproduction cycle and everything too. When you think about these guys, only a few are going to make it. So the more you have, the better chance that someone will get there. Versus producers, it's a longer commitment. They're going to have fewer offspring because they do a lot more care to this. So there's a better chance, you know, penguins. I love watching penguin movies too. Oh, March of the Penguins is great. They spend a lot of time caring. There's always a parent with that little penguin. One will go off and get the food, come back, then the other one takes over. This will really affect how the population happens. You know, if something really bad happens, this whole population can be wiped out easily, versus this one's a little bit more stable. So there are lots of factors that can affect it. Competition between food. So I was talking about overproduction. Food is a limited resource, so you have to compete to survive. This was a struggle for existence. If you can't eat, you can't make it. You know, those three questions. Can I eat it? Will it eat me? Can I mate with it? If you can't eat it, then, or if it eats you, you know, those are two of the key things. We need a lot of variation. Members within species are going to have individual differences, and you know, we have to be able to inherit these differences too. And sometimes those differences can lead to advantage. We're not clones. Remember, we go through sexual reproduction, which means we get a lot of genetic variation. And you know, sometimes it just works out genetically that we get a new combination randomly, thanks to mutations and stuff, that might lead to a whole new trait. You never know. That variation really drives things. Survival to reproduce. So that gets to the survival of the fittest. You know, you want to make sure that you pass on the best genes to the next level. You don't want to give your kids like funky genes and say, okay, well, you figure it out. I couldn't figure it out. Maybe you will. That's why, you know, I always see the animals out in the wild. They're going to try to find the best mate possible. And you think about the lions. They're always going to go for the big, muscular male lion, not the scraggly one. You know, that's just the way it works. Now, there's several modes for natural selection. We'll hit on each of them in the next couple of slides. But this is talking about how does the trait change. So these different modes is basically talking about how we're not eliminating traits, we're just passing the best ones on to the next generation. And we're going to be kind of selective. So we're going to look at tail length in this little figure right here. So depending on which one you fall in will determine how your tail length is going to be altered. So the first one's directional. So this is where one extreme trait is the fittest, selecting against the others. So we have our status quo right here, and then you can see like here we have a short, average tail, then a long tail. So what we saw that with the long tail started to get selected for, more and more the population got the longer tail because it looks like a snake and it can scare predators. If you know, everyone knows snake, get away. So it'll go away. So what that lizard would do is use its tail as like a warning system, pretend it's a snake, and then the predators would go away. With stabilizing, you're kind of going for the extreme phenotypes are less fit, and you go for this intermediate. So you're going to see that short tails and super long tails aren't great. So we're going to go for this average in the middle. That's going to give you the best option to survive. In disruptive selection, what's going to happen, you're going to select for both extremes. So with or without a tail, short tail versus a long tail. Nothing in the middle. Middle's not going to help you. You either need it for balance in trees or to help you keep predators from catching you. So a good example of directional is using these moth in England, this peppered moth. It's found in two varieties, this light gray and this dark gray, and I have pictures of both of them. Now, the light gray used to be more common in these certain years, but then we started to see between time that the dark ones becoming more and more common. And when we started to see this in certain areas, more industrial areas. So what happened is we also had an increase in the Industrial Revolution. So more and more coal is becoming a major source of power in England. And when that happened, the coal settles on all the buildings and everything's more dark. So with the moth, they want to blend into their environment so they don't stick out. So as the environment was becoming darker and darker, the moths adjust their color. So the dark ones were selected for. So you went to this extreme phenotype to survive. Now, stabilizing, a good example, this is where we are going to select against the extremes and kind of get in the middle. Human birth weight. We know that humans with low birth weight, they're going to be very weak. They have a lot of health problems. And if you're a super large baby, you're going to have a lot of problems passing that through the birth canal. You have to go through C-sections. So that's we see a push more towards this average birth weight for the baby and the mother for both of them to survive. You know, this was more of a thing we've been in the past. We've had the improvement in medicine to kind of influence away from this average, but this was one way that human birth weight was adapted over the years. And disruptive is where we select against the mean and go to the two extremes. This is probably one of the weirdest ones you're not going to find out there. Like I said, it's the rarest, and it can lead to deviation in the species line. When that happens, you're pretty much like cutting a line across, and that's not going to happen. This is one of the rarest ones. I couldn't find like a really good example when it comes to talking about it, but Darwin's Finches kind of change into this, where they all had like an average beak length at one point in time, but then as they had to adapt to two different extreme environments, they had different types of food sources that really affected how they turned out. All right, so another key thing with evolution is called balanced polymorphism. So this is where multiple alleles can persist indefinitely. makes you wonder, if there's a harmful allele, why wouldn't we find a way to eliminate it? A good example is sickle cell disease. With this one, if we know sickle cell disease, it has a problem with, it codes for an abnormal form of hemoglobin that leads to a sickle shape due to the protein folding. So you do not want to have the recessive condition. And this is an example where being a heterozygote can be an advantage, and it happens to kind of overlay with the environment and where you live. So thanks to the certain population that needs this advantage of being a heterozygote to where they're mildly affected by sickle cell disease, it's kept this in a gene pool for a long period of time. So let's look at it. So this is a map in the case where we're battling malaria, and we know that it's a parasite that normally enters the red blood cells and causes them to burst, and it's transmitted by mosquitoes. Now you see a huge outbreak in malaria, the occurrence of it, and if we overlay it with the presence of sickle cell allele in Africa, and depending on your genotype will determine if you are bitten by the mosquito and you get malaria, how much you'll be affected. So if we know malaria targets normal red blood cells, if you have the normal gene type, all of your red blood cells will be affected. If you're the heterozygote, partial of them will be affected, your healthy ones, and your normal ones, your ones with the sickle cell, will halt to spread. And then if you have the recessive one, you're already suffering from anemia. So this example being the het is an advantage. Another cool thing that evolution kind of talks about is sexual dimorphism. So in any of the vertebrate species, the sexes are alike, but there are some where they look distinctly different from the males and the females. Sometimes it's the females that are more elaborate, sometimes it's the males. Examples, the peacock. So male peacocks have this huge tail. And it's really elaborate. And when you think about it, what's the point of keeping this around? Well, maybe it's the bright colors and stuff to attract the females. She doesn't look very interested when you look at this picture right here. So the bigger the tail, the better the little dance they do. It can make it, more attractive to a female. But when you think about it, why would you keep this elaborate tail? Think about the maintenance it takes, how it would slow you down, it makes flying difficult. So why would you keep this advantage right here if it could personally or affect you or your survival later on? That's one of the things we're trying to figure out. And due to sexual selection, special forms of this variation affect how the ability to find mates. There's two different types here that I have really cool videos from, because I try to find as many as possible because I love to watch these little videos. So an intrasexual, this is where members of one sex compete among themselves for access to the opposite sex. And then we have intersectional, so members of one sex choose their mates from among multiple individuals of the opposite sex. One of these videos is two male giraffes fighting, because I think giraffes are they're my favorite animal, and it's kind of interesting. These two males are fighting like crazy because they smelled a female and they're trying to prove their strength. But then the female winds up going with the one giraffe that's not there, because she's like, well, I don't want to deal with this stuff. She winds up going with the other one. And the other one deals with the cool little birds of paradise, where they clean up their little nest area and they do a little dance to try to attract the female. So watch these. They're not too long. They're cute. So we talk about evolution. It happens at different levels. So we have the microevolution and then the macroevolution. So microevolution happens within a population. It's easily observed, non-controversial. Think of the antibiotic-resistant video that you watched, and here's the link to it here. You see the evolution. This population is changing over time. How it happens, there's processes that can cause it. You have a mutation. Natural selection applies to it. We're going to affect the gene flow, how we move the genes in the population, and the genetic drift can affect that. And I'll talk about genetic drift on the next slide. Now, the one that people have trouble with is macroevolution. So this is a large scale change over time, and people want things right away. We want to see results right away, and this takes time. And this is where you see the more controversy between non-biologists, because we, as a biologist, we know evolution is slow. It's a slow process, but people want to see results quickly. I know in labs, y'all want to see stuff happen right away. But macroevolution takes time. That's why it's had a little bit harder to get support for it. So how else can you alter allele frequency? So genetic drift is one of them. So this is when it comes completely due to chance. It has nothing to do with your traits or survival of the fittest and stuff. It's just randomly how it happens. And what happens is chance is going to completely eliminate alleles from the population. Now, there's two different ways. This is a cool video that walks you through each of them a little bit more detail. One is called the founder effect. And basically, this is talking about the sample size and when it goes off to start a new population. So with this one, we have a population of brown beetles and a population of green. Well, what's happening is this one, he wants to leave his old house and go join a new population. So what that happens, he's going to introduce some new alleles into the population. And now the allele frequencies are going to be different, because right now the frequencies, these alleles were all brown, these were all green. Now him bringing his brown alleles into the population is going to change the frequencies, and over time, it's going to change the whole population. The bottleneck is when the population drops rapidly over a short period of time. Natural disasters, prime example. So, just randomly day at the beach, a tsunami comes in and wipes up everyone that was in the ground. By chance, if you happen to be in a tree, you survive. There doesn't matter. It wiped up all that population. It randomly selected. You can't control what controlled right there. So that's the end of this group. The next one is going to talk about support for evolution.